In the dusty plains and bustling streets of Mexico's northern state of Sinaloa, a young boy named Vicente Carrillo Fuentes first opened his eyes to a world that seemed both harsh and full of opportunity. Born into a family that would later become infamous across continents, Vicente's early years were unremarkable on the surface, but they hinted at the complexities that would define his life. The Carrillo Fuentes family was rooted in tradition, with strong ties to community and loyalty. Vicente grew up in a household where discipline and expectation were constant companions, where every action had consequences. The men of the family were quietly preparing for futures that would inevitably intersect with the currents of Mexico's evolving economy. Though not yet immersed in the criminal underworld, young Vicente was exposed to its indirect influences, through whispers, hushed conversations, and the constant presence of power and negotiation in the adult world around him. Education, though limited, played a pivotal role in shaping him. Unlike many of his peers, Vicente showed a keen mind for observation, calculation, and strategy. Teachers noted his quiet intensity, his tendency to watch before acting, and his ability to read people in ways that went beyond mere instinct. In these early school years, Vicente was learning the patterns of human behavior, not for academic success, but for navigating a far more dangerous arena. Family dynamics were central to Vicente's upbringing. His older brother, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, was already on a path to becoming one of the most notorious figures in Mexico's drug trade. Watching Amado navigate ambition, risk, and influence left a deep impression on Vicente. He admired not just his brother's charisma, but also his strategic mind. Though the two were close, there was an unspoken competition, a silent measuring of skills and capabilities that would shape Vicente's own ambitions. The socio-economic environment in which Vicente grew up was both limiting and compelling. Northern Mexico in the 1960s and 70s was a place of stark contrasts. Poverty shadowed by opportunity, tradition juxtaposed with modernization, and law intertwined with corruption. Young Vicente learned early that survival required both caution and ingenuity. He witnessed communities torn apart by scarcity, but he also saw how resourcefulness could turn disadvantage into advantage. This duality, the tension between vulnerability and power, became the defining lens through which he would view the world. Vicente's adolescence was marked by both curiosity and restlessness. While he performed adequately in school, he gravitated more toward informal apprenticeships, learning from local business people, farmers, and tradesmen. These experiences, though seemingly mundane, honed his understanding of negotiation, logistics, and the flow of goods, skills that would later translate into the operations of far more complex and illicit enterprises. As he matured, Vicente displayed a natural ability to connect with people from diverse backgrounds. He could speak with a farmer one moment and a merchant the next, seamlessly adjusting his demeanor and language to suit the listener. This adaptability wasn't just charm, it was a tactical skill, a quiet assertion of influence that would become critical in his adult life. Those who knew him as a teenager often remarked on his calm composure, his patience, and the subtle way he seemed to assess situations before acting, a trait that belied his young age. Family obligations also weighed heavily on Vicente. The Carrillo Fuentes household, while tightly knit, relied on the contributions of each member. Responsibilities at home, whether tending to younger siblings or assisting in family businesses, instilled in him a sense of duty and resilience. This early immersion in adult responsibilities nurtured a discipline and strategic foresight that few of his contemporaries possessed. Despite the innocence of youth, shadows of the family's future were already present. Through subtle conversations and exposure to his brother Amado's rising influence, Vicente began to understand the mechanisms of power, how decisions could ripple through communities, how alliances could be forged and broken, and how influence, when wielded correctly, could open doors that were otherwise inaccessible. By the time Vicente reached his late teens, he had cultivated an impressive mental map of social hierarchies, opportunities, and risks. He understood the importance of patience, observation, and timing. In quiet moments, he would reflect on the ambitions that stirred within him. Ambitions rooted not in recklessness, but in a calculated desire for control and legacy. These reflections were often tinged with suspense, as if he were aware that the choices he made in the coming years would shape not only his own life, but also the destiny of his family. While his formal education was limited, Vicente's informal tutelage under mentors, family elders, and community leaders provided him with insights that traditional schooling could never offer. He learned about the flow of goods across regions, the subtle dynamics of influence, and the importance of establishing trust while maintaining leverage. These lessons, combined with his natural acuity, prepared him for a world in which knowledge was power and timing was everything. By the end of this chapter of his life, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes was no longer just a boy from Sinaloa. He was a young man poised at the edge of destiny, aware of the currents swirling around him, and ready to navigate a path that would eventually lead him into the complex and dangerous world of Mexico's criminal underworld. Though the notoriety of his later years was still distant on the horizon, the foundations of strategy, resilience, and ambition had been firmly laid. As Vicente stepped into early adulthood, the quiet intensity of his childhood didn't just linger, it sharpened. He still listened more than he spoke, analyzed more than he reacted, and calculated before he ever committed. The world around him, especially in northern Mexico, was starting to show its hidden framework, the invisible chains of influence, loyalty, and consequence that truly dictate power. For most young men, adulthood meant one of two things: resignation to an ordinary life, or a desperate gamble to escape it through migration or rebellion. Vicente chose neither. He opted for something more deliberate, a silent internal preparation. It was as if he knew instinctively that acting too soon is far more costly than waiting for the right moment. This was the time when Vicente's entire mindset crystallized. Unlike others who climbed the ladder with charisma or brute force, Vicente's method was all about delayed assertion. He would hold back, observing every single variable, mapping out the entire landscape before making a move. This wasn't fear. It was a carefully crafted strategy. He saw the world not as a series of random events, but as a system of signals. Every person, every offer, every shift in the environment was just another piece of data. Those who knew him then often mistook his silence for detachment. They didn't realize he was busy building a mental blueprint of how power really moved beneath the surface. His brother, Amado, was a huge influence during this period. Not through direct lessons, but by being a living, breathing example of how to rise. Vicente watched how Amado executed ambition without drama, commanded authority without raising his voice, and built networks through pure strategy, not spectacle. While many would crumble in the shadow of a powerful older sibling, Vicente studied the blueprint. The most critical change in Vicente wasn't about his beliefs or his feelings, it was about his process. He began to develop a mental rulebook for operating in high-risk environments. Rule number 1, never react to pressure. 2, never reveal your true intentions. 3, never negotiate without leverage. And 4, never trust momentum over a solid structure. This psychological self-control became both his armor and his greatest asset. People who later met him in a position of power would always comment on his unnerving composure, a calm that was being meticulously engineered during these formative years, long before he held any real authority. Another key part of his development was his belief in control through invisibility. While others equated leadership with being seen and heard, Vicente saw a massive advantage in the exact opposite, being unreadable, untraceable, and unpredictable. He learned to hide his emotions, not just because he was naturally reserved, but as a conscious tactic. To Vicente, visibility was a liability. If people could figure you out, they could manipulate you. If they could predict your next move, they could outmaneuver you. This logic would define his future leadership style, one that favored indirect influence and strategic silence. At the same time, Vicente's awareness of the economic and political world around him was growing. He started to see how blurry the lines between legal and illegal could be, how institutions could be swayed by money, and how morality tends to bend when survival and power are on the line. This didn't instantly turn him into a criminal, but it did break down the mental barriers that separate a normal life from an illicit one. In his mind, the difference between an acceptable and unacceptable action wasn't a matter of principle anymore. It was about risk, secrecy, and the final outcome. This is where Vicente truly diverged from the average person. Not because he was looking for danger, but because he normalized the logic of a system that operated outside the conventional rules. Before he ever got involved, he understood that this parallel world wasn't just illegal. It had its own order, its own code of conduct. This mental shift allowed him to step into that world later without any internal conflict, because he had already solved the moral equation in private. Another subtle but crucial development was his emotional austerity. He trained himself to minimize personal attachments, knowing they could be used against him. He stayed neutral in conversations even when provoked. He studied people not to make friends, but to predict their behavior. He kept his opinions to himself, knowing that a stated position could become a weakness down the line. In every interaction, he was like an actor rehearsing for a life where feelings were a strategic liability. During these years, Vicente's identity transformed from a passive observer to a silent strategist. He wasn't doing anything major yet, but his mindset had already shifted. He was no longer thinking like an outsider. He started to understand that in this world, intelligence wasn't just about what you know or how brave you are. It was about your ability to make smart decisions with incomplete information while minimizing your own exposure. His patience during this transition is one of the most remarkable things about him. Most people who get a glimpse of that kind of power rush towards it, driven by greed or impulse. Vicente did the exact opposite. He waited. He delayed his entry until he had absolute clarity. He preferred to be the last one in the door with a rock-solid plan, rather than the first one in on shaky ground. This trait would later make him incredibly difficult to trap, to infiltrate, or to negotiate with. By the time Vicente finally approached the edge of operational involvement, his internal transformation was complete. He didn't enter that world blindly or emotionally. He entered with a pre-built psychological toolkit founded on restraint, observation, neutrality, and systemic thinking. This is what made him fundamentally different from the cartel leaders who rose through violence or charisma. Vicente's rise wasn't an accident. It was engineered from the inside out, long before anyone saw it happen. And so, this chapter of his life closes not with a bang, but with the quiet completion of a metamorphosis. The young, silent observer had evolved into a man with all the internal tools needed to navigate the world's most dangerous systems without ever losing control of himself. He hadn't yet committed to the path that would make him infamous, but psychologically, he was already there. The next phase of his life would no longer be about preparation. It would be about application, the moment where a deliberate, calculated mind meets the brutal reality of the game. The story of a successor is often written in bold strokes. A dramatic power grab, a bloody struggle, a charismatic figure seizing the throne. But some rises to power are far quieter, almost invisible. They happen not with a bang, but with the steady, uninterrupted hum of a machine that simply keeps running. This is the story of how Vicente Carrillo Fuentes inherited one of the world's most complex enterprises, not by force, but by becoming the very embodiment of continuity. Long before his predecessor, Amado, met his end, Vicente was already perfectly positioned. He wasn't a loud architect of ambition, hungry for the spotlight. Instead, he was the quiet heir, strategically placed at the heart of the organization. His proximity to decision-makers, accountants, logisticians, and diplomatic channels had built him an invisible reserve of authority. While others built power through public displays, Vicente's power grew through absorption. He inherited roles simply by being the stabilizer in rooms where volatility was a death sentence. When Amado traveled, it was Vicente who maintained the equilibrium. He managed the phone logs, the financial pacing, the shipment calendars, and the expectations of foreign partners. Most critically, he held the trust of lieutenants who despised surprises more than they disliked the idea of succession. This pre-positioning is the key to understanding why the transition that followed appeared so seamless to the outside world. Vicente didn't need to take command. He was already holding pieces of it. When the central figure disappeared, his existing authority simply expanded to fill the void. When the news of Amado's failed surgery finally broke, the question on everyone's mind, both inside and outside the organization, wasn't, who will fight for control? It was, will the machine keep functioning? In decentralized high-stakes trades, continuity is worth more than charisma. Vicente's authority didn't stem from fear or theatrical displays of personality. It came from his fundamental relevance to that continuity. He possessed the institutional memory. He held the maps of all the critical relationships, and he embodied the cautious habits that the top brass had learned to trust. Analysts at the time misread the calm as a fluke, an accident. It was anything but. It was a system built on risk mitigation behaving exactly as designed. The least destabilizing option automatically becomes the governing outcome. Vicente was that option. Not because of any post-event maneuvering, but by the very design of his prior roles. In the days following Amado's death, while intelligence agencies braced for fractures and infighting, the signals were the exact opposite. The cadence continued. Intermediaries got their calls answered. Timelines were honored. No one with money on the line experienced a single delay. In transnational enterprises, reliability itself is a form of sovereignty. The actor who can keep the clock running becomes, by definition, the custodian of power. Vicente's first decisions weren't grand declarations of a new era. They were simple, administrative acts of continuity. He confirmed existing contacts and renewed standing arrangements without renegotiation, sending a clear message to all layers of the organization. The calendar itself remained intact. This was the strategic equivalent of planting a flag without ever lifting a hand. Uninterrupted function equals uncontested rule. A second layer of his genius was informational management. He avoided public gestures and made no visible changes to the command structure. This strategic restraint served two critical purposes. Internally, it reassured stakeholders that nothing radical was coming. Externally, it denied law enforcement the shock signature. They rely on to model leadership changes and exploit instability. Where other successions produce loud, trackable tremors, this one produced near silence. And in a world where sensors are pointed at you from every direction, silence is the rarest and most valuable asset. The absence of turbulence became the ultimate proof of control. Vicente's rise also benefited from what strategists call path dependency. The idea that choices made in the past constrain the options available in the future. Amado's organizational architecture was already built around trusted family members for the most sensitive roles. The organization was already conditioned to interface with kin for high-level clearance. In that environment, replacing Amado with an outsider would have required a lengthy, risky explanation. Replacing him with Vicente required none. The logic of least explanation is often the secret logic of succession. Another key factor was Vicente's mindset. He thought in gradients, not in jolts. While rival cultures favored bold assertions to quash dissent before it could start, Vicente approached consolidation as a test of procedure. His theory was simple. Keep the procedures consistent long enough, and dissent will have no oxygen to breathe. He didn't accelerate or redesign the system. He honored its inherited tempo. This might seem like a paradox. By refusing to improve the inherited system right away, he actually maximized its chances of survival. In that critical first season after a power vacuum, stability was the single most valuable commodity. Think about it from the perspective of foreign partners facing immense uncertainty. They aren't looking for a new, revolutionary vision. They're looking for non-disruption. Vicente's early communications to them were essentially continuity statements. No renegotiations, no deviations, no reinterpreting past promises. This simple messaging eliminated the #1 trigger of succession-era crises: contract collapse caused by panic. And that is precisely why, despite the death of its high-profile architect, this transnational supply chain didn't display the typical collapse curve. From a documentary perspective, what Vicente accomplished was not a takeover, but a non-collapse. In this domain, that is the superior definition of power. Internally, he made another shrewd move. He didn't reshuffle personnel. Rotating people in and out of key positions introduces anxiety. Anxiety breeds factions, and factions invite unacceptable risk. By refusing to reshuffle, he signaled that loyalty would be measured by one thing and one thing only: performance and continuation of duty. Public declarations of fealty were worthless. This single structural norm disincentivized theatrics. Factions never emerged because the system offered no reward for visibility. People stayed silent and did their jobs, not out of fear, but out of rational alignment with a regime that promised stability. At the same time, Vicente quietly compressed the decision-making radius. He didn't hand out new powers. Instead, he became the gatekeeper of information. When information scarcity is controlled from a single point, all options belong to that point by default. The organization naturally adapts and looks to the source from which clarity arrives. Vicente became that source, not by proclaiming it, but by outlasting the initial noise and chaos without ever losing procedural precision. From a governance perspective, his rise illustrates a principle often studied in the transition of nations. The inertia of institutional habit can appoint a leader even without an explicit coronation. The men around him didn't need to be persuaded. They needed continuity far more than they needed a choice. Vicente supplied that continuity, and so, the choice simply evaporated. This is why outside observers who were searching for visible coronation rituals, the grand meetings, the public anointments, found none. The system had already converged on its new leader before they even started looking. So, the rise of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes wasn't the story of a man forcing his way to the top. It was the story of a system selecting its least destabilizing component to carry its inherited equilibrium forward. The defining characteristic of his consolidation wasn't assertion, but maintenance. He rose not like a conqueror storming a castle, but like a placeholder who becomes permanent simply by working, immediately, silently, and without ever interrupting the calendar. In a world where disruptions are loud and catastrophic, the quietest actor became the inevitable successor, precisely because he offered the one commodity that all power systems prize above charisma: uninterrupted function. After the dust of succession finally settled, the rule of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes shifted. It was no longer about just holding things together. It became about building a stable, structured incumbency. And the first thing you notice about this period isn't some grand expansion or dramatic power play. It was consolidation. The entire apparatus under him started acting like a well-oiled machine, one that had fully accepted its new leader. Think about it. Communication channels, financial flows, even diplomatic dealings. Everything started operating with a predictable rhythm. This wasn't the frantic improvisation of a crisis anymore. This was the calm, measured pulse of a mature organization. Financially and administratively, the Juárez structure switched from emergency mode to governance mode. The goal wasn't to crush competitors, but simply to hold on to the influence they already had, all while staying off the radar of law enforcement. Vicente wasn't a builder. He was a caretaker, a guardian of equilibrium. Internally, the organization transformed into a finely tuned bureaucracy. Decisions weren't made on a whim. Clearances and permissions followed a strict inherited logic. Vicente's leadership style valued invisibility. He deliberately avoided rebranding the organization. He didn't do dramatic reshuffles, and he steered clear of any destabilizing new ideas. For him, continuity wasn't just something that happened. It was something he actively curated and managed. The entire psychology of the organization felt like a stewardship after a monarchy has ended. The crown wasn't used to shout commands, but to quietly prevent any movement that might attract the blinding glare of a spotlight. The defining rule under Vicente was restraint. It wasn't because ambition had died, but because being visible had become strategically unacceptable. At the same time, the world outside was changing. The pressure from surveillance wasn't just a random raid here or there. It was now a structural, constant presence. By the time Vicente took the central seat, transnational law enforcement had matured. Cooperation between domestic and foreign investigators was standard procedure, not a special favor. Their analytical tools were better. They could track financial signals with incredible accuracy, and they had become incredibly patient. The world Vicente governed was not the same world his predecessors had built their empires in. The world around him had developed new eyes for seeing into the shadows. So, his entire operation felt like a regime under glass, constantly observed, profiled, and analyzed, even when investigators couldn't get direct access. His leadership became a constant test against this immense pressure. One of the most defining shifts of his rule was how power itself was measured. In earlier decades, power was all about seizing territory and making bold, disruptive moves. In Vicente's era, dominance was measured by the absence of collapse. A system that doesn't implode under permanent scrutiny is, by its very nature, stable. Achieving that stability required a strategic shift inward. It demanded absolute discipline in processes, in communication, and in every signal the organization sent out. In that sense, Vicente governed like someone who understood that his primary opponent wasn't a rival cartel, but the simple mathematics of exposure. In the modern world, every mistake leaves a digital trail. Every trail ends up in a ledger. And every ledger eventually becomes a legal weapon. His mid-tenure was the period when this cold, hard calculus became the central organizing principle. The suspense of this era comes from a double compression: immense pressure from above and the constant risk of fragility from within. Investigators were systematically pushing, expanding their legal nets, patiently gathering tiny fragments of information they could later piece together. At the same time, Vicente had to prevent his own people from overreacting, because any panic or rash move would produce the exact signals that surveillance systems were designed to detect and convert into criminal cases. His leadership became an exercise in navigating a very narrow corridor. He had to suppress any chaotic movement inside his own organization while simultaneously outlasting the relentless observation from the outside. This dual constraint forged a style of rule that was almost countercultural for his world. He enforced the quietest conduct in a domain that had historically rewarded noise and spectacle. How did he manage this? By stamping out unpredictable, discretionary actions. Most commands followed pre-approved pathways. Decision-making authority remained strictly vertical. If you wanted to deviate from the plan, you needed a damn good justification. This bureaucratization had a profound psychological effect on his subordinates. They adapted to an era where quiet compliance was rewarded and improvisation was punished. Not with violence, but with being pushed away from the center of power. In this environment, loyalty was redefined. It wasn't something you swore with words. It was something you proved through quiet, procedural obedience. This created a workforce perfectly tuned for continuity, not disruption. The ideal foundation for a regime trying to survive under the microscope. Meanwhile, the climate outside continued to evolve. The public narrative against his organization hardened, not because of some dramatic insider leak, but through the slow, steady accumulation of intelligence patterns. Investigators weren't relying on heroic one-off interceptions anymore. They were relying on time and math. The pressure became almost algorithmic. This forced Vicente to govern like someone who knew that time itself was the real prosecutor. He understood that the longer a structure exists under scrutiny, the more likely a seam, a crack, will eventually be found. This led to his core strategic instinct: minimization. Make fewer moves, leave fewer traces, and reduce the overall volume of detectable behavior. His rule wasn't aggressive, it was defensive governance on a massive scale. The psychological tone of the organization during his mid-tenure therefore shifted from being driven by ambition to being constantly aware of a potential audit. In the previous era, under Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the guiding question was, what new territory can we expand into? But under Vicente, the question became, what can we continue to do without triggering a catastrophic collapse? This philosophical pivot is the very core of his leadership legacy. He professionalized survival. Not cinematic, gun-blazing survival, but survival in a legal, bureaucratic, and statistical sense. His goal was to avoid the creation of new criminal cases, to avoid generating traceable signatures, and to avoid creating the conditions that would allow suspicion to be formalized into proof. In practice, this meant Vicente had to become a governor of risk more than a governor of territory. His mid-tenure is best understood as an exercise in compression. Compress the organization's surface area, compress its volatility, and compress its detectability. This is precisely why his era seems less theatrical to historians looking from the outside. And it's why, to someone who was on the inside at that time, it felt like one long, tense standoff against the inevitable. To rule under permanent observation is to rule inside a countdown. The suspense of his tenure wasn't about whether he would try something bold, it was about whether the system could simply remain intact long enough before the machinery of investigative patience finally assembled an irreversible case against it. So, the middle period of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes' leadership is defined by a paradoxical kind of power. A power that measures itself not by what it does, but by what it successfully avoids doing. His governance was a wager against entropy, a slow duel with surveillance. A regime that attempted to defeat inevitability, not through confrontation, but by making itself smaller and quieter. That is the logic of his consolidation phase, an era where command meant preventing collapse rather than performing dominance, and where the greatest threat wasn't a rival, but the slow, accumulating arithmetic of time under scrutiny. Welcome back to the channel. When Vicente took the reins, the world of organized crime was a battlefield of raw power and brutal spectacle. But as his tenure wore on, the rules of the game began to change, quietly but irrevocably. The world outside his fortified perimeter was evolving. Surveillance was no longer a sporadic flash of a camera. It became a constant, institutional gaze. Borders became more transparent to those hunting him, as intelligence agencies learned to share, to cooperate, and to wait. The pursuit of justice transformed from a high-speed chase into a marathon of patience. The flashy headlines that once glorified cartel exploits were replaced by structured, policy-driven reports. In this new climate, Vicente's greatest strength, his mastery of continuity and secrecy, was slowly turned against him. His organization was a fortress built for secrecy, but the systems watching him were designed for endurance. Time, not a rival, became his executioner. Internally, his later years weren't marked by rebellion or fracture, but by a quiet exhaustion of advantage. The machine kept running, but with every passing year, every transaction, every quiet order, a new layer of interpretive residue was added to the ever-growing investigative archives. Think about it. In the past, law enforcement attention came in bursts, allowing shadows to reform. But Vicente's era was one of continuous watching. The institutional calendars on the other side never reset. The data never forgot. Transactions that once vanished into thin air started to reappear as retroactive evidence, pieces of a puzzle being assembled over years. This created a strange paradox. The more successful he was at maintaining order and staying in power, the more complete the picture of his organization became for those watching. His operational success was directly feeding their archival accumulation. So, how did he adapt? Not with more violence or a grand escalation. He contracted. He pulled decision-making authority into smaller and smaller circles. He cut off communication channels, minimized signatures, and did everything possible to reduce his organization's digital and physical footprint. The leadership style shifted from aggressive expansion to a maintenance regime, focused entirely on denying any trace of its existence. He wasn't trying to make more money. He was trying not to be seen. But there's a limit to how much you can shrink. Below a certain threshold of activity, a system doesn't just get quieter, it begins to slow down, not by design, but by attrition. What initially looked like masterful restraint eventually started to look like a system running on fumes. The organization didn't collapse in a fiery explosion. It just thinned. It was a slow, gravitational decline, pulled down by the weight of the environment around it, not by a single decisive blow. As the agencies on the other side finished their long cycle of patience, the atmosphere around Vicente shifted from surveillance to capture. This wasn't triggered by a single catastrophic mistake. It happened because years of scrutiny had finally reached a critical mass. When you have enough years of patterns, correlations, documented movements, and witness testimony all stacked up, a case doesn't just get stronger, it acquires a sense of inevitability. Vicente's final years in power unfolded under this shadow of inevitability. There was no panic, no high-stakes drama. It was the silent, shared understanding that the statistical edge had flipped. His entire governance style, perfected for stability and control, was now facing an adversary it couldn't intimidate or outmaneuver: institutional time. When the end finally came, it was nothing like the movies. There was no theatrical confrontation, no last stand. His detention was an act of what you could call terminal bureaucracy. It was the culmination of documents, not of force. The arc of his leadership didn't end with a subordinate's betrayal or a rival's bullet, but with the quiet arrival of paperwork whose momentum was simply greater than any network he had managed to preserve. In a way, the ending perfectly mirrored his rule: quiet, procedural, and completely devoid of spectacle. Post-detention, Vicente's entire public identity was inverted. The man who was once defined by his invisibility became defined by the public record. The secretive apparatus he commanded became the subject of court filings, transcripts, academic analyses, and case histories. His physical isolation in prison wasn't just a loss of freedom. It was a fundamental conversion from an active player to a historical archive. Incarceration didn't change what he did, but it forever changed how it was framed. Everything that had been lived in secrecy would now be interpreted through documentation. The man who governed to avoid leaving a footprint was ultimately preserved forever as paperwork. the very thing he spent his entire career trying not to generate. So, what is his legacy in the history of organized crime? It's not one of explosive growth or legendary brutality. It's one of stewardship in an age of modern pressure. He represents a critical transition, the moment when cartel leadership entered the era of perpetual observation. The primary enemy was no longer a rival syndicate with guns, but the forensic patience of governments armed with data. Vicente's story demonstrates that the age of the flamboyant, larger-than-life narco-lord was structurally over. To survive under constant surveillance required a completely different temperament: administrative, cautious, procedural, and driven by silence. He governed not like a conqueror, but like a custodian, desperately trying to prevent the collapse of an inherited empire in the dawn of the data age. Analysts outside the world of crime often point to his era as a case study. It shows that once international intelligence coordination and legal frameworks reach a certain level of maturity, even the most disciplined and secretive leadership becomes time-bound. Vicente's strategy bought him years, but it couldn't buy him immunity. He proved that a brilliant strategy can delay the inevitable, but it can never abolish it. His rule represents the final evolution of the pre-digital cartel governor, the last of a generation to operate before full-spectrum traceability became an inescapable reality. His downfall wasn't a failure of his skill, but a defeat by the epoch he found himself in. In the ledger of history, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes is a transitional king, a custodian of an old architecture who tried to maintain equilibrium in a world that was learning how to turn that very equilibrium into evidence against him. His strength was order. His defeat was time. His final state, incarcerated, archived, and studied, completes the story of an era where invisibility was still possible, but never permanent. And it leaves us with a structural lesson far more enduring than any headline. In the age of cumulative scrutiny, survival without spectacle isn't a path to escape. It's just a path to a longer delay.
The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe to join Criminology and step deeper into the dark with us.